Have you ever considered the strange contradiction in how we understand human creativity? We celebrate it in our museums, concert halls, and innovation hubs. We're moved to tears by it, changed by it, willing to pay fortunes for its artifacts. And yet we rarely ask the most obvious question: why does this force exist within us at all? Think about it. From an evolutionary perspective, our creative capacity far exceeds what survival requires. The ability to imagine what does not yet exist, to bring forth new realities from pure thought, this isn't merely adaptive, it's excessive, even extravagant. Our nearest genetic relatives show rudimentary tool use and problem solving, but nothing approaching the cathedrals, symphonies, or quantum theories that humans produce. Something profound happened on our evolutionary branch. A capacity emerged that cannot be explained by mere survival advantage. What's equally puzzling is how we experience this creative impulse. When we're in the flow of genuine creation, whether writing poetry, coding an elegant solution, or solving a scientific problem, we often describe it in almost mystical terms. It wasn't me writing, an author might say. The characters took over. Or a mathematician might describe how a solution revealed itself after years of struggle. There's a curious sense that creation doesn't come from us, but through us, as if we're conduits for something greater. This paradox becomes even more intriguing when we look at history's most revolutionary creators. From Leonardo da Vinci to Einstein, Marie Curie to Mozart, those who most dramatically expanded human possibility often report feeling not like the originators of their insights, but like their discoverers. They speak of being visited by ideas, of serving as vessels for something that seems to have its own intelligence and purpose. Einstein himself described his insights as something he stumbled upon rather than constructed. Now consider an even stranger pattern: the link between creative breakthroughs and a sense of meaning. When humans create, whether art, technology, relationships, or ideas, we experience a peculiar satisfaction that goes beyond pleasure. There's a sense of alignment with purpose, a feeling that this is what I was made for. This experience is so universal across cultures and throughout history that it suggests something fundamental about our nature. But here's where the mystery deepens. We live in an age that has largely abandoned transcendent frameworks of meaning. The divine narratives that once situated human creativity within a cosmic context have been replaced by materialist explanations that, while scientifically robust, often leave us with a sense of existential flatness. We're told that consciousness is just brain chemistry, purpose is an illusion, and creativity merely a side effect of neural complexity. And yet, the experience of creation itself continues to feel imbued with precisely the meaning and purpose our worldview claims doesn't exist. What if this contradiction points to something we've missed? What if the creative impulse that defines humanity isn't just a curious evolutionary development or a pleasant psychological state, but a cosmic principle working through us? What if our urge to create, to transform, to bring forth what doesn't yet exist, is actually the universe's own evolutionary impulse becoming conscious of itself? There was one thinker who looked unflinchingly into the abyss of a universe without inherent meaning, and saw, not despair, but the most extraordinary possibility, that the divine isn't something to be worshipped, but something to be created. That humanity isn't the abandoned child of a dead god, but the embryonic form of something that might one day deserve that title. A philosopher whose most famous declaration, "God is dead," has been so profoundly misunderstood that we've missed his actual revelation. That divinity isn't gone, but waiting to be born through human creativity itself. Have you ever wondered if your creative impulse might be more than a personal talent or quirk? If it might be the very force through which the universe evolves? There's something profoundly inconsistent in how we understand creativity in the modern world, and this inconsistency becomes visible when we examine it closely. On one hand, we operate within a scientific paradigm that describes the universe as fundamentally mechanical, particles and forces interacting according to fixed laws, with no inherent purpose or direction. In this framework, human consciousness is an emergent property of neural complexity, and creativity merely a function of our brain's ability to form novel connections between existing information. Yet on the other hand, Our actual experience of creativity contradicts this mechanical model. When we're engaged in genuine creation, we don't feel like biological computers randomly recombining data. We experience something that feels remarkably like participation in a process larger than ourselves. Artists describe being seized by inspiration. Scientists speak of uncovering or discovering truths that seem to have existed before we thought them. There's a persistent sense that creativity involves tapping into something that transcends our individual consciousness. This contradiction becomes even more striking when we look at how we value creative works. If creativity were merely clever neural recombination, we might appreciate it for its novelty or utility, but not with the profound reverence we actually show. We don't just admire great art, music, architecture, or scientific theories. We're moved by them, sometimes to tears. We make pilgrimages to see them, build institutions to preserve them, structure educations around transmitting them. This suggests we intuitively recognize something more significant in human creativity than our materialist framework can explain. What's particularly revealing is how we describe moments of creative breakthrough. Across cultures and throughout history, humans consistently reach for metaphors of connection to something transcendent. We talk about inspiration, literally being breathed into. We speak of genius, originally meaning an attendant spirit that guides a person. Even our most secular creative figures often resort to quasi-mystical language when describing their process, suggesting that what flows through them comes from beyond them. Consider also the curious correlation between creative achievement and a sense of meaning. In a universe without inherent purpose, we would expect the recognition of meaninglessness to be psychologically devastating. Yet those who have most fully acknowledged the absence of pre-given meaning, artists, philosophers, and scientists who have abandoned traditional frameworks, often report not despair, but liberation. Their creative work becomes not just a distraction from cosmic emptiness, but somehow an answer to it, as if the act of creation itself generates the meaning that the universe otherwise lacks. This pattern suggests an alternative perspective. What if creativity isn't just a curious feature of human psychology, but a fundamental property of reality itself? What if the same generative principle that has driven the universe from simplicity to complexity, from hydrogen to human consciousness, is now expressing itself through our creative acts? What if human creativity is the universe's own evolutionary impulse becoming self-aware? This isn't mysticism disguised as science. It's an observation based on a simple anomaly. Our subjective experience of creativity doesn't match our objective explanation of it. When we create, we don't feel like complex machines producing output based on input. We feel like channels for something that wants expression. We feel in those moments like we're fulfilling our nature rather than just exercising a capability, as if creation were what we're for. This anomaly was recognized by one philosopher who saw it not as a problem to be resolved, but as a clue to humanity's most extraordinary possibility. He recognized that the death of God wasn't the end of the story, but its beginning. That the absence of a transcendent creator doesn't leave us in a meaningless void, but opens the possibility that creation itself is our inheritance and task. Have you noticed this contradiction in your own creative experiences? Have you felt in moments of genuine creation that you were connecting to something beyond yourself, participating in a process that seemed to have its own intelligence and direction? The year is 1881. In the Swiss alpine village of Sils Maria, a solitary figure walks along the shores of Lake Silvaplana. He's 37 years old, plagued by chronic health problems that have forced him to abandon his academic position. His published works have been largely ignored or dismissed by the intellectual establishment. He lives frugally, moving between modest boarding houses as the seasons change, seeking environments that might alleviate his physical suffering. This is Friedrich Nietzsche, not yet the towering cultural figure he would posthumously become, but a lonely thinker wrestling with the most profound philosophical crisis of the modern age. He has seen, with devastating clarity, what many of his contemporaries could not yet face, that the metaphysical foundations of Western civilization are crumbling. The belief systems that once gave coherence and meaning to human existence, particularly Christianity with its moral framework and promise of cosmic purpose, no longer hold intellectual credibility in an age of scientific discovery. Unlike other atheistic thinkers of his era, who celebrated this development as simple liberation from superstition, Nietzsche recognized it as a cultural catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. Without the metaphysical architecture that had oriented human life for millennia, he foresaw a civilization sliding toward nihilism, a condition where nothing has inherent meaning or value, where everything is permitted, because no ethical framework can claim ultimate authority. It was here, walking by the lake in the summer of 1881, that Nietzsche experienced what he would later call the fundamental conception of his most important work. In his autobiography, he describes the moment with unusual emotional intensity. If one reckons the days, it occurred in the beginning of August 1881. It was jotted down on a piece of paper with the inscription, 6,000 feet beyond man and time. This insight wasn't just another philosophical idea, but something that struck him with the force of revelation, a way forward through the abyss of meaninglessness he had diagnosed. What made Nietzsche uniquely qualified to discover this path? Perhaps it was his unusual combination of intellectual backgrounds. Trained as a philologist, a scholar of ancient languages and texts, he had immersed himself in Greek and Roman thought before the Christian era. He understood how these civilizations had constructed meaning without relying on the moral framework that would later dominate Western thought. At the same time, he was deeply versed in the German philosophical tradition, particularly Kant and Schopenhauer, whose explorations of the limits of human knowledge and the nature of will provided crucial conceptual tools. But perhaps most important was Nietzsche's personal experience of creativity. Though known primarily as a philosopher, he was also a gifted musician and poet who had experienced firsthand the transformative power of artistic creation. He had felt what it meant to be seized by inspiration, to serve as a conduit for something that seemed to come through him rather than from him. This experiential knowledge of the creative process wasn't incidental to his philosophy, but central to it. What Nietzsche realized in that pivotal moment by the Swiss lake was that the death of God, the collapse of transcendent meaning, wasn't the end of human possibility, but potentially its beginning. The absence of a divine creator didn't condemn humanity to meaninglessness, but opened a space for humans themselves to become creators of meaning, values, and perhaps even a new kind of divinity. This insight found expression in the concept that would become central to his mature philosophy, the will to power. Not power as domination over others, a common misinterpretation, but power as the capacity to create, to generate, to transform, the power to bring forth new realities from the raw material of existence. Nietzsche saw this creative force not as a mere human capability, but as the fundamental principle of life itself, expressing itself through all living things, but reaching its most self-conscious expression in human creativity. In his personal notebooks from this period, Nietzsche wrote, "What is the seal of liberation? No longer being ashamed in front of oneself." This cryptic statement points to his emerging vision, that human beings might overcome their alienation from their own creative nature, recognizing that the capacity to generate meaning isn't a presumptuous human overreach, but the fulfillment of our deepest potential. Have you ever considered that what we call inspiration, that mysterious creative force that seems to come through us rather than from us, might be not just a psychological curiosity, but a cosmic principle expressing itself through human consciousness? Nietzsche's investigation began with a careful examination of how meaning and value had been created throughout human history. While most philosophers had sought universal, timeless principles that might ground ethics and purpose, Nietzsche took a radically different approach. He applied his philological training to trace how value systems had actually emerged, evolved, and been replaced over time. What he discovered was revolutionary. Every moral framework, every system of meaning that humans had lived by, had been created rather than discovered. On the Genealogy of Morals, he demonstrates how even our most fundamental ethical concepts, good, evil, virtue, sin, have histories. They didn't descend from heaven or emerge from pure reason. They were fashioned by human cultures in response to specific conditions, needs, and power dynamics. This historical analysis might have led to relativism or despair. If all values are human creations, are they merely arbitrary? But Nietzsche saw something more profound. The very fact that humans have repeatedly created frameworks of meaning revealed something essential about our nature. We are not just creatures who need meaning. We are creatures who generate it. Creation isn't something humans occasionally do. It's what we fundamentally are. Nietzsche found evidence for this view in the earliest Greek civilization, particularly in pre-Socratic culture. Before the rise of philosophical rationalism and later Christian morality, the Greeks understood life as fundamentally creative and generative. Their concept of physis, often translated simply as nature, carried connotations of growth, emergence, and self-generation that were later lost. The cosmos itself was understood not as a static mechanism, but as an ongoing creative process. This perspective was expressed most vividly in Greek tragedy, which Nietzsche had studied intensively early in his career. In The Birth of Tragedy, he explores how these dramatic performances allowed Greeks to confront the terror and meaninglessness of existence, not by escaping into comforting illusions, but by transforming suffering itself into aesthetic experience. The tragic artist didn't deny the darkness of reality, but created from within it, demonstrating humanity's capacity to generate meaning even in the face of ultimate meaninglessness. Further evidence came from Nietzsche's analysis of how new religious movements emerge. While conventional views saw religious founders as discoverers or recipients of divine truth, Nietzsche recognized them as creators of new value systems. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he presents the Persian prophet Zarathustra, Zoroaster, as the first to create a cosmic moral framework of good versus evil, an act of creative imagination so powerful that it reshaped human consciousness for millennia. Most tellingly, Nietzsche examined those rare individuals throughout history who had most dramatically expanded human possibility, the artists, philosophers, and visionaries who introduced genuinely new perspectives into the world. What distinguished them wasn't just intellectual capacity, but creative courage, the willingness to generate new values rather than simply inheriting existing ones. These figures, from Buddha to Goethe, Napoleon to Beethoven, demonstrated that the greatest human achievements didn't come from discovering pre-existing truths, but from bringing new realities into being. This insight led Nietzsche to a radical reframing of human purpose. If creation is our fundamental nature, then our highest fulfillment wouldn't come from conforming to established values or discovering ultimate truths, but from becoming ever more conscious and deliberate creators, not just of art or ideas, but of values, meanings, and ways of being that expand the boundaries of human possibility. In his personal correspondence from this period, Nietzsche expresses this vision with unusual clarity. My formula for human greatness is amor fati, love of fate, that one wants nothing to be different, not in the future, not in the past, not for all eternity, not only to bear what is necessary, but to love it. This isn't passive acceptance, but creative affirmation, the ability to transform even suffering and limitation into material for creation. Nietzsche's notebooks reveal how deeply personal this insight was for him. Despite chronic illness, social isolation, and professional rejection, he had discovered in his own creative work a way of generating meaning that required no external validation or cosmic guarantees. His writing wasn't just describing this path, but demonstrating it. Each book an example of how meaning could be created in a universe that doesn't provide it ready-made. Have you experienced moments when you weren't just making something but being remade by the creative process itself? When the act of creating seemed not just to produce something external to you, but to transform your very way of being in the world? As Nietzsche deepened his investigation into human creativity, he made a discovery that would transform his understanding of both human nature and cosmic evolution. He began to recognize that what he had initially seen as a specifically human capacity, the ability to create meaning and value, was actually an expression of something more fundamental in the nature of life itself. This insight crystallized in his concept of the will to power, which appears throughout his later works. The will to power, in Nietzsche's mature formulation, isn't primarily about control over others, a common misinterpretation. Rather, it describes a basic drive towards self-expansion, growth, and overcoming resistance that characterizes all living things. Plants stretch toward the sun, overcoming the resistance of gravity. Animals develop increasingly complex adaptations, overcoming environmental challenges. What distinguishes this from mere survival is that life consistently expends energy beyond what mere persistence would require. It inherently seeks to extend its capacities, to become more than it currently is. Nietzsche saw human creativity as the most self-conscious expression of this fundamental life principle. When humans create, whether in art, science, philosophy, or social structures, we're not engaging in some optional activity separate from our basic nature. We're manifesting the same generative impulse that has driven evolution from simple organisms to complex consciousness. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, "Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, overpowering of the foreign and weaker, suppression, hardness, imposition of one's own forms, incorporation, and, at the least and mildest, exploitation." This isn't a celebration of domination, but a description of how life perpetually transforms its environment, incorporating it into new and more complex forms. What made this insight revolutionary was how it reframed the relationship between humanity and the cosmos. The traditional Western view, shaped by both Christianity and Enlightenment rationalism, positioned humans as separate from nature, either as fallen creatures seeking redemption or as rational observers studying objective reality. Nietzsche's vision dissolved this separation. Human creativity wasn't something imposed upon a passive or mechanistic universe. It was the universe's own creative principle, becoming conscious of itself through human activity. The evidence for this perspective appeared in unexpected places. Nietzsche noted how even our most rational pursuits, like science, are driven by aesthetic and creative impulses. Scientists don't just passively record facts, but actively construct theories that transform how we see reality. The history of science isn't one of steady accumulation of knowledge, but of revolutionary paradigm shifts, creative reframings that change the very questions we can ask. Einstein's theories, for instance, weren't simply discoveries, but acts of imagination that reorganized our conceptual landscape. Nietzsche found similar patterns in language itself. Through his philological work, he recognized that languages don't just describe a pre-existing reality, but actively shape how that reality appears to us. The metaphors embedded in our words aren't just poetic flourishes, but the conceptual structures through which we experience the world. When new metaphors emerge, often through artistic or philosophical innovation, new aspects of reality become visible. Language itself is a creative medium through which the world is continually reimagined. Perhaps most significantly, Nietzsche observed how consciousness itself evolves through creative acts. He rejected the notion of consciousness as a fixed capacity that simply represents an objective world. Instead, he saw it as an evolving medium that develops new capacities through creative engagement with reality. The consciousness of a contemporary human differs qualitatively from that of our ancestors, not just in what it knows, but in how it structures experience. And this evolution hasn't been driven primarily by passive adaptation, but by active creation, by individuals and cultures generating new ways of seeing, thinking, and being. This insight led Nietzsche to a profound revaluation of the creative process. Creation wasn't just something humans do within an already complete cosmos. It was the means through which the cosmos itself continues to evolve. Human creative consciousness wasn't an anomaly in a mechanical universe, but the leading edge of a process that has been unfolding since the beginning, the universe becoming increasingly aware of and able to transform itself. In his personal journals from this period, Nietzsche sometimes used the metaphor of pregnancy to describe this relationship between human creativity and cosmic evolution. We are, in his view, pregnant with possibilities that exceed our current understanding, gestating futures that will transform not just human society, but the nature of consciousness itself. The pain and struggle of creation isn't incidental, but essential to this process, just as birth involves necessary labor. Has it ever struck you as strange that we speak of conceiving ideas, of giving birth to new works? Could these metaphors point to something deeper than mere analogy, to a recognition that human creativity participates in the same generative principle that has driven cosmic evolution from the beginning? As Nietzsche continued his investigation, a remarkable pattern began to emerge. one that connected individual creative breakthrough with the larger evolutionary trajectory of the cosmos. He began to recognize that what we experience as inspiration, those moments when ideas seem to come through us rather than from us, might be more than a psychological curiosity. They might be instances of connecting with the same creative principle that has been driving the universe from simplicity to complexity since its beginning. This pattern became visible when Nietzsche examined the phenomenology of creative experience across different domains. Whether in artistic inspiration, scientific insight, philosophical breakthrough, or even athletic performance, humans report strikingly similar experiences when operating at the heights of their creative capacities. There's a dissolution of ordinary self-consciousness, a sense of channeling rather than generating, a feeling of participating in something larger than individual identity. These experiences have been documented across cultures and throughout history, suggesting something fundamental about the relationship between human creativity and cosmic process. Consider how consistently great creators describe their work as discovery rather than invention. Mozart spoke of compositions arriving in his mind, fully formed. Einstein described his insights as a gift from the angels. Artists throughout history have attributed their works to muses, spirits, or divine inspiration. Even in our secular age, the most innovative minds often report that their breakthroughs came not through methodical reasoning, but through intuitive leaps that seem to emerge from beyond conscious thought. Nietzsche saw in these accounts not primitive superstition, but a valid intuition about the creative process. The sense that something is working through us in moments of creation isn't a delusion, but a direct experience of connecting with generative forces that transcend individual consciousness. The dissolution of ordinary self-awareness in these states isn't a loss, but an expansion, a temporary alignment with broader creative currents that normally operate beneath conscious awareness. This perspective transformed how Nietzsche understood the evolutionary significance of art, philosophy, and culture. These weren't just human adornments to an otherwise complete reality, but the means through which reality itself continues to evolve. Every genuine creative breakthrough, every new perspective, form, or idea that expands the boundaries of human consciousness, doesn't just add to culture, but participates in the ongoing creation of the cosmos itself. The pattern became even clearer when Nietzsche examined how revolutionary creative works transform consciousness over time. The innovations of artists like Wagner, scientists like Darwin, or philosophers like Kant didn't just add new content to existing frameworks of understanding. They fundamentally altered how subsequent generations would perceive and engage with reality. It's not merely that they saw things differently, they made different things visible. This suggested to Nietzsche that creative breakthrough isn't just subjective expression, but the evolution of consciousness itself. This evolutionary perspective appears throughout Nietzsche's mature works, particularly in his concept of the Übermensch, or overhuman, often mistranslated as Superman. This isn't a reference to biological superiority or social domination, as later misappropriations would suggest, but to a potential future state of human consciousness that stands in relation to our current state as we stand in relation to earlier hominids. The Übermensch represents not a different species, but a different quality of consciousness, one that more fully embodies and consciously participates in the creative principle that Nietzsche saw as fundamental to life itself. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche expresses this vision through his prophet's declaration: "Man is something that shall be overcome. What is the ape to man? A laughingstock, a thing of shame. And just the same shall man be to the Übermensch, a laughingstock, a thing of shame." This isn't contempt for humanity, but recognition of creative evolution. The same process that transformed earlier forms of consciousness continues through us toward future possibilities we can dimly intuit, but not fully comprehend from our current perspective. What makes this pattern particularly significant is how it reframes the relationship between humanity and divinity. If human creativity participates in the same generative principle that has driven cosmic evolution, then the urge to create isn't separate from what religious traditions have called the divine. It's the direct expression of it. The divine, in this view, isn't a transcendent being that created the cosmos in the past, but an immanent creative principle continuing to unfold through cosmic evolution, now becoming conscious of itself through human creative activity. Have you noticed how the most transformative creative works don't just affect what we think, but how we think, expanding the very boundaries of what can be perceived, felt, or understood? Could this pattern suggest that creativity isn't just producing new content within consciousness, but evolving consciousness itself? The implications of Nietzsche's insight extend far beyond philosophy into how we understand human purpose, spiritual fulfillment, and evolutionary potential. If creativity isn't just something we occasionally do, but the cosmic principle expressing itself through us, then our relationship to our own creative nature requires profound reconsideration. First, this perspective transforms how we understand the purpose of human existence. The question, "What is the meaning of life?" has traditionally been answered either with reference to divine will, we exist to serve God's plan, or dismissed as meaningless in a purely material universe. Nietzsche's vision offers a third possibility. We exist as the means through which the universe evolves consciousness of itself. Our purpose isn't imposed from above or arbitrarily invented, but emerges from our nature as expressions of cosmic creativity. This doesn't mean everyone must become an artist in the conventional sense. Creation, in Nietzsche's expanded understanding, encompasses all forms of bringing forth what doesn't yet exist, whether in art, science, relationships, organizations, or one's own character. The scientist discovering a new theory, the entrepreneur building a new kind of organization, the parent nurturing a child's development, the individual crafting an authentic life, all are participating in the same fundamental creative process. What matters isn't the domain, but the quality of creative engagement, the extent to which we consciously participate in and extend the generative principle working through us. This understanding resolves a fundamental tension in modern culture between spiritual fulfillment and creative achievement. These have often been positioned as separate or even opposing paths, the contemplative seeking inner peace versus the creator driven by restless ambition. Nietzsche's perspective dissolves this opposition. True spiritual development isn't achieved through escape from the creative struggle, but through more conscious participation in it. And authentic creation isn't separate from spiritual unfoldment, but its direct expression. Consider how this reframes the common experience of creative dissatisfaction. Creators in every field know the feeling of completing a work only to immediately sense its limitations, feeling pulled toward the next creation that might more fully express what remains unexpressed. This is often interpreted as neurotic perfectionism or personal ambition. But what if it's actually the cosmic creative principle working through us, continuously reaching beyond what has been achieved toward what might yet be possible? What we experience as creative restlessness might be the universe's own evolutionary impulse. Perhaps most significantly, Nietzsche's vision transforms our understanding of human potential. If we are expressions of the same creative force that has driven evolution from single-cell organisms to complex consciousness, then our current state isn't the endpoint of development. Just as earlier forms of consciousness couldn't have imagined human awareness, our present consciousness likely cannot comprehend the potential states that might evolve through continued creative development. What Nietzsche called the Übermensch isn't a fantasy, but a recognition that consciousness continues to evolve through creative activity. This perspective sheds new light on those rare individuals throughout history who have dramatically expanded human possibility. The Buddhas, Leonardos, Einsteins, and others who seem to access modes of awareness beyond conventional human capacity. These figures aren't anomalies or supernatural exceptions, but forerunners, expressions of potentials latent within human consciousness that might become more widely accessible through continued evolution. In his personal notebooks from the late 1880s, Nietzsche explored this evolutionary potential through the concept of the eternal return, the thought experiment of whether one could affirm living the same life infinitely, with every detail unchanged. This isn't a cosmological theory, but an existential test of creative affirmation. Can you embrace your life so completely, participate so fully in its creative possibilities, that you would choose it again and again, exactly as it is? This standard isn't about perfection, but about creative intensity. the degree to which one has actually lived rather than merely existed. The eternal return connects directly to Nietzsche's understanding of divinity. If God isn't a being separate from the cosmos, but the creative principle working through it, then becoming divine isn't about escaping human limitations, but about more fully embodying and consciously participating in this creative process. The path isn't transcendence of our creative nature, but its complete affirmation and expression. Have you experienced how creative fulfillment isn't just about producing external works, but about a quality of engagement with life itself? How the moments of greatest creative intensity are also moments of greatest presence, where the boundary between creator and creation seems to dissolve? Why has Nietzsche's profound insight about human creativity as cosmic principle remained so obscured in our culture? The answer isn't a conscious conspiracy, but rather powerful systemic forces that maintain the separation between creativity and meaning. Religious institutions have consistently positioned divinity as transcendent rather than immanent. By locating the divine outside the natural world, these traditions establish a fundamental divide between creator and creation. Humans become servants rather than embodiments of divine creativity. Christianity particularly intensified this separation by framing creative ambition as potential sin, the prideful desire to be like God. The biblical Tower of Babel story perfectly captures this perspective. Creative reaching beyond approved boundaries becomes dangerous presumption. Philosophical traditions have similarly divided reality into opposing principles. From Plato's separation of ideal forms from material particulars to Descartes' division of mind from body, Western philosophy has fragmented what Nietzsche saw as a unified creative process. By positioning truth as something to be discovered rather than created, these traditions obscure how even our most objective knowledge involves creative participation. This separation intensified during the scientific revolution, which positioned the ideal knower as detached observer rather than creative participant. The mechanistic worldview that emerged didn't just describe reality differently, but established a fundamentally different relationship between consciousness and cosmos, one where human creativity became subjective projection onto an objective world rather than participation in the world's ongoing creation. Economic systems have further commodified creativity, transforming it from an intrinsic expression of human nature into an instrumental activity valued primarily for its products. Under industrial capitalism, creative work became increasingly specialized and compartmentalized, something certain people do in certain contexts rather than the fundamental activity of human existence. Artists became a separate professional class, their work cordoned off from ordinary life. Educational systems reinforced this division by focusing on standardized knowledge and specialized skills rather than the development of creative capacity. The ability to replicate existing knowledge became valued over the ability to generate new perspectives. Even arts education often emphasized technical proficiency over transformative expression. These separations become internalized in individual psychology. We learn to experience our own creative impulses as separate from our serious purposes, as personal quirks rather than cosmic participation. The artist who feels like an outsider, the scientist who can't connect their work to meaning, the ordinary person who doesn't recognize their daily activities as creative, all experience the psychological effects of these systemic divisions. These divisions serve specific interests. Religious institutions maintain authority by positioning themselves as intermediaries to the divine. Philosophical and scientific establishments preserve expert status by separating knowledge from creation. Economic systems maintain productivity by channeling creative energy into marketable products. These aren't conscious conspiracies, but systemic patterns that reproduce themselves because they serve existing power structures. The most profound effect of these separations has been the epidemic of meaninglessness in modern culture, what Nietzsche diagnosed as nihilism. When creativity is disconnected from cosmic purpose, the result is profound alienation from our own nature. We find ourselves in the bizarre situation of being expressions of cosmic creativity while believing ourselves to be either obedient servants or accidental byproducts. Either way, disconnected from the creative force that constitutes our essence. Have you noticed how creativity is consistently marginalized in our fundamental institutions, treated as an add-on to education, a luxury in economic terms, a specialized activity rather than the basis of human fulfillment. Nietzsche's vision of human creativity as cosmic participation has been consistently misunderstood, marginalized, or actively suppressed for three key reasons, each revealing how threatening this understanding is to established structures of authority and control. First, this vision demands radical self-responsibility that many find unbearable. If meaning isn't given from above, but created through participation, there's no external authority that can tell us definitively how to live or what to value. Traditional frameworks, while demanding in practice, offer the psychological security of clear guidelines and absolute truths. Nietzsche's perspective offers no such certainty. It requires each person to participate in the creation of meaning rather than receiving it ready-made. This responsibility has been deliberately misinterpreted as mere relativism or nihilism. Nietzsche's famous proclamation that God is dead has been presented as a gleeful announcement rather than what it actually was, a sober diagnosis of a cultural crisis demanding a new understanding of meaning. By portraying Nietzsche as simply destructive of traditional values rather than offering a more demanding alternative, critics have avoided engaging with the creative responsibility his vision requires. Second, Nietzsche's understanding threatens institutional authority. Religious organizations maintain power through positioning themselves as necessary intermediaries between humans and divine reality. If divinity expresses itself directly through human creativity, these institutions lose their privileged position. Similarly, academic and scientific establishments maintain authority by positioning themselves as arbiters of truth rather than participants in its creation. A perspective that recognizes all knowledge as creative participation undermines these claims to special authority. Nietzsche experienced this institutional resistance firsthand. His works were largely ignored during his lifetime, and when they received attention, they were often deliberately misinterpreted. After his death, his ideas were distorted to serve various agendas, most notoriously by National Socialism. These gross misinterpretations served not only political purposes, but also allowed his more radical insights to be dismissed through guilt by association. Third and most profoundly, Nietzsche's vision challenges our basic understanding of identity. Traditional frameworks position the self as either a soul created by God or a biological entity shaped by genes and environment, something stable that exists prior to its actions. Nietzsche reverses this relationship. The doer is merely a fiction added to the deed. The deed is everything. The self isn't something that exists and then creates. It is continuously created through creative action. This dissolves conventional identity boundaries in ways many find deeply unsettling. If we are expressions of a cosmic creative principle rather than self-contained individuals, the separation between self and world becomes permeable. The divisions between human and divine, individual and universal, blur into a more fluid understanding that threatens familiar sense of bounded selfhood. Nietzsche's vision has been consistently domesticated, even by those claiming to embrace it. His ideas about creativity are reduced to conventional notions of artistic self-expression rather than cosmic participation. His critique of traditional morality is interpreted as license for self-indulgence rather than a call for more demanding self-creation. These misinterpretations aren't random but serve to contain the truly radical implications of his thought. Ironically, the creativity Nietzsche identified has been most fully experienced in areas often considered separate from serious philosophy, by artists, musicians, dancers, innovative scientists, even athletes in states of flow. These have directly experienced the creative participation Nietzsche described, while formal discourses have maintained the separations his vision dissolves. Have you noticed how discussions of creativity are kept separate from serious questions of meaning? How creative experiences that dissolve boundaries between self and world are treated as temporary states rather than glimpses of a more fundamental reality? The final question isn't whether Nietzsche was right. The evidence increasingly suggests he glimpsed something profound about reality and human potential. The question is what it means to live as if this understanding were true. What changes if we recognize our creative capacity not as a personal talent, but as our participation in the universe's ongoing evolution? The transformation begins with a fundamental shift in how we understand existence. Rather than seeing ourselves as either biological accidents or creatures serving a transcendent creator, we might recognize ourselves as expressions of the creative principle driving cosmic evolution. Our creative impulses, whether expressed through art, science, relationships, or character, aren't separate from our spiritual nature, but its direct manifestation. We create not to escape meaninglessness, but to participate in meaning's ongoing generation. This doesn't abolish the insights of science or religious wisdom. It reframes them as different modes of creative participation rather than competing claims about static reality. Scientific discovery becomes creative engagement with existence's patterns. Spiritual practices become ways of aligning with the creative principle expressing itself through us. The opposition between scientific materialism and religious transcendence dissolves into a more integrated understanding. Imagine an education treating creativity not as a specialized subject, but as the foundation of all learning, recognizing that mathematics, science, history, and language are creative domains where students generate understanding rather than merely absorb information. Imagine a spirituality measuring growth by expanding creative capacity, the ability to transform experience into meaning, limitation into possibility, suffering into insight. Imagine an economy valuing activities based not primarily on measurable output, but on how they extend creative potential. This perspective transforms how we understand our struggles. Creative breakthrough doesn't come despite resistance, but through engagement with it. Challenges that seem to block our path aren't separate from the creative process, but essential elements of it. Just as an artist needs the resistance of their medium, we need our specific limitations to engage the creative principle fully. Nietzsche expressed this through amor fati, love of fate. Not passive acceptance, but creative affirmation, transforming even suffering into material for creation. This extends to how we understand history and future. Rather than seeing human development as progress toward a predetermined end or meaningless change, we might recognize it as creative evolution, the universe continuously generating new possibilities through each era's specific conditions. If this resonates with your experience, you may already be engaged in this process more deeply than you realize. Those moments when you lose yourself in creative flow, when time dissolves and you feel connected to something larger than individual identity, these aren't anomalies, but glimpses of your fundamental nature as an expression of cosmic creativity. The invitation isn't to abandon your current path for some specialized pursuit, but to recognize the creative dimension in whatever you do. Whether raising children, building organizations, solving problems, creating art, or simply crafting a life expressing your unique possibilities, you're participating in the same fundamental process, the universe evolving consciousness through the specific form that is you. If you found value in this exploration, share it with others who might resonate. Leave a like if you believe conversations about creativity and purpose matter in our fragmented world. Subscribe to join a community exploring how to live more consciously as expressions of creative possibility. Most importantly, share in the comments how you've experienced this creative principle, moments when you felt yourself participating in something transcending, yet including your individual identity. As Nietzsche wrote, one must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. The chaos isn't separate from creation, but essential to it. The uncertainty, struggle, and resistance we feel aren't obstacles to our purpose, but conditions through which new possibilities emerge. What if the divine isn't something to worship from afar, but something to embody through ever more conscious creative participation? Have you begun to recognize yourself not just as a creature who occasionally creates, but as creation itself becoming conscious through your specific form?